Thank you. In Russian version it was like whether the Third World War would occur, there will be none, but the struggle for world will obliterate everything, eliminate, annihilate everything. Okay, then can I ask you to provide your comment on that scenario, on that topic?
I'm more cautious than that. Let me.
Но Австралия далеко, она спасет.
Well, Australia is very far. You'll be able to save yourselves.
That's why many Australians have taken out visas to travel to New Zealand. It's even further. Let me go back to the subject at hand, and I'll build on what my friend David Lipton had to say before. And I'm going to make some very short, sharp remarks about what the G20 should do in the future. It was no easy decision by the United States and by other countries back in 2008 to create this institution. Secondly, if you read its mandate, it was conceived by the member states who represent 80 to 90% of global GDP. It was to be the principal international body of economic governance. Thirdly, it's performed its function well in crisis mode. Fourthly, it has performed less well since the crisis, the immediate crisis, dissipated. So there's a very practical question which arises now. I think there's a grave danger as the G20 moves from country to country each year. It follows what I think is a slightly idiotic European tradition, which is everybody's got to have a theme. For God's sake, it reminds me of all the conferences I go to in Southeast Asia, where we all got to have a different shirt and a different costume for every conference that we go to each year. It is patently absurd. No, it wasn't an Australian idea, David Lipton. It came from our friends in Southeast Asia, and I'll pay you back for that later on. It was President Bush who asked me to wear a Stetson, remember. So forget themes. This is a serious subject. The sustained institutional management of the global economy. Therefore, it needs a continuing agenda, and this is my first somewhat unpopular proposal. It needs a continuing secretariat. It should not be located in a particular capital. It should move whoever is hosting the G20 in a given year. But it needs a rolling high-level institutional memory and a rolling high-level institutional agenda and a capacity to give it effect. My other thought is this. Given that the G20 will be hosted in Germany this year under Chancellor Merkel, the world now cries out for a leading global champion of global free trade, because everything else is rolling in the other direction at the moment. And anyone who thinks that this won't be at an economic cost to each of the economies represented in this room is deluding themselves. Trade has been the vehicle through which we have added to our national and global wealth, and its distributional impact within our economies has been significant, although imperfect, and requiring domestic policy measures to close the inequality gap. But if ever there was a need for a chairperson of the G20 this year to take on the mantle of saying that protectionism will kill us all, as it threatened to do in the 1930s, it is now. Chancellor Merkel has that challenge before us, and she should seize it with both hands. Failing that, what I fear is that with the mood of protectionism, capital P, small p, not even necessarily using tariffs, not even necessarily using subsidies, but in fact deploying a whole series of other non-tariff barriers to trade, that we begin to embrace the Smoot-Hawley tariff by stealth over time and slowly strangle global economic growth as a consequence. Trade, in its contribution to global GDP, has been net negative for how many years now, David? 3, 4? So as a consequence, we have a real problem. This is new. The prosperity we had in the 20, 25 years or so after 1990 has in fact begun to evaporate, and this has been one of the principal vehicles. So I go back to the fact that the G20 was an institution we created to deal with the crisis, to ensure there would be not a repeat of that crisis coming out of the financial sector, a formidable mandate in itself, but in prosecuting sustained and balanced global economic growth, it needs strong leadership, a continuing agenda, a permanent secretariat, albeit one that moves from capital to capital. And I say that as having been with Prime Minister Medvedev, one of its co-founders and one of its supporters ever since.